Today at Speedy's Garage, we're going to go over a few things on the new Quincy QT-54 air compressor we picked up for the shop. First off, it came very well packaged on a pallet and was actually bolted down. Delivery was very quick. And it actually came in a crate that I've already disassembled. It was so much crating that it took me about 20 minutes just to get all the crating out of it. And there's all of that. The closet's 3x4, but I picked up a 3/4 inch thick piece of 4x6 mat and then just cut it with a razor knife. And I found that if I dipped the blade in water or wet the surface a little bit, the water would act as a lubricant and make cutting it much easier. I used a long square T to keep the cut straight, and it wasn't too hard to cut actually. So I've got some extra pieces left over, and some of it I used as a jack stand pad so I don't gouge up my shop floor. The compressor is a 5-horse 60-gallon 2-stage, and it's capable of a max 175 psi with 15.2 cubic feet per minute. Most air tools are going to run at 90 psi, and this one's capable of 15.7 cubic feet per minute. It should be plenty for anything I ever want to do. I wanted to really just buy it once and be done with it, so that's why I picked this one out. It seemed like it had the best reviews online, and a whole lot of friends of mine that have quite a bit of experience with these recommended it. This is the first one I've had that's 230 volt, and I thought it would just be easy to go into a hardware store and buy a cord for it, kind of like you do for your washer or dryer, but I actually found that wasn't the case and had to buy a cable and a plug and build it myself. I don't know if that's typical or not, but that's what I had to get. If you can find one locally that you just plug in, you lucked out. And here's what I ended up with. It's a very flexible, thick cord, good for 30 amps. It's 4 conductor and they're stranded, but this air compressor only uses 3. So I use the red, black, and green, and these are your 2 line, and obviously that's your ground. And then the neutral isn't used in this application, so I just snipped it off, and I won't even use that lug. I just left the lug completely off, so when I plug it into the wall, nothing's even connected to that, just for safety. You get this box, and this is how I did it. This is what I was able to find to get it done. And the lugs plug into it, and you just want to make sure that if you end up with the same scenario, that you match it up to the plug in your wall. And then you just assemble it. And obviously I used 10 to 12 gauge ring terminals crimped on the various wires. The red and the black, like I said, are going to be the 2 line. Green is for ground. You just slide them into place. And I make sure they're kind of secure and away from each other. And then this box came with an adapter, and depending on how thick your cable is determines which orientation the adapter gets. So in my case it's that way. And then it's got 2 screws that you line up. And you tighten those down. And this is what you end up with. As you can see, that green adapter holds the cable in place. So now we got to worry about the air compressor side. Start by making sure it's in the off position, and there's a single screw on this one that you remove. You don't have to take it all the way out, just when the box comes loose. And there's what we're working with. So these are your 2 line, and then that screw back there is going to end up being our ground. And it'll match up to what they have. And there's also a diagram in the manual that confirms the connections. And Quincy included spade connectors for these, so I'm just going to take them out and use them. And then for the ground, I'll have to use one of my ring terminals that I have. I picked up this conduit 90-degree elbow, and it threads. It's got a lock nut on the back side, and the Quincy compressor electrical box has a hole for something just like this. So I'm going to run my cable into here and then my individual wires out to the connections. So I'm going to take a couple of quick measurements to see about how much wire we're going to need. And I hope you can see that when you're cutting your wire, there's a guide, at least there is on the back of this box, that tells you how long each wire needs to be and how much of the rubber coating needs to be stripped. So just like I did for the box portion of this, I'm going to measure out what I think is about right. And here you got to be careful. This rubber coating, it's soft, but it's big, so it's a little bit hard to cut. And you want to be very careful and just cut the exterior and not get into your wires that are inside. And I found, kind of scoring it with the razor, you can then bend it like that and it'll start to split. And just do that till you get it all the way around and can pop it off. Now, I worked around it very carefully, and if I got into some places where it didn't seem like I wanted to let go, I gently, very gently used some small wire snips just to snip the rubber. Again, be very careful because the rubber on these wires is also really soft. And then you can just slide it off. On this one I did 4 inches. I think that should be plenty, but I can always trim if it's too much. I went ahead and cut the white wire off because, as I said earlier, we're not going to use it. That just leaves the black, red, and green. This elbow will go completely apart. You just slide your wires through. Bend it where you think it needs to be. Put the backing plate on. Which is a little tricky with that fat wire in there. And then start your screws. And this is what mine ended up looking like. I wanted enough of that heavy gauge rubber inside this elbow to keep things protected as much as possible. And now we'll do a test fit on the air compressor to see how much wire we need to trim. If your control box has a plastic plug installed, just pop it out. Now we can do a test fit of the wires. So the black one could be trimmed just a little bit, red's about right, and then we'll probably trim another 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch off the green, and we're good to go. So I used my wire cutters, and I like this type. They're pretty cheap if you get them at a inexpensive hardware store. The wire obviously goes in between the jaws there. Gives you a pretty precise cut each time. Ring terminals and spade terminals are installed. And I went one extra step. Since this is an air compressor and there could be some vibrations, I used a rubber grommet. And this, I believe, is a 1/2 inch conduit. And I got a, I think that's a 9/16 maybe, or 5/8, probably 5/8. grommet. But anyway, it was one I had in the box. It fit. If yours is a little bit tight, you can put some rubbing alcohol on that to help it slide into place. And that's just to cushion and protect those wires. This is 30 amps, 230 volts. The last thing you want is a ground, or short rather, something to ground on. This is what I'm getting at. So I think that's probably a little extra safety precaution that's cheap and easy to do. Now you're ready to make your connections at the compressor switch. So I had to move one of the compressor connections that was already installed out of the way in order to get to the ground lug. If you have to do that, be careful. Don't pull on the wire without disconnecting your lock screw here, because you could run the chance of pulling the wire out of your spade. Don't forget to install your lock ring on your elbow before making these connections, or you have to take it all back apart again. Ask me how I know that. So now we're just going to start by connecting the ground, and this isn't easy. It's a little bit tight. So if you have to, like I said, if you have to move wires out of the way, just do it carefully, and you want to make sure everything's nice and snug. And these have to be done in an order, because the back screws you can't get to once you install the front connections. So now I'm going to go ahead and reconnect the original compressor wire. And these are stiff wires, so I might have to work with them a little bit. And I try not to let anything get into a bind. I always want things nice and smooth. And so I'll use a Sharpie or some other non-sharp object to manipulate the wires the way I want them to run. Now we'll tighten our screw up here. Now we'll make our plug side connections. And tighten those lock screws. Make sure everything's not bound up. I like to make sure things can vibrate a little bit if they need to without too much trouble. Now we can reinstall our box. We'll do one last check to make sure everything feels nice and tight. And on the lock ring, I used a flathead screwdriver. Just gave it a tap. And then made sure it was nice and secure. Now I'm going to put the switch plate cover back on, or switch box. Make sure everything works before I tighten it down. Make sure it's not contacting anything. And that's it. So now I've got my 4-foot electrical cord hooked up, ready to go, and it'll handle the 30 amp load this compressor requires. I'm going to tell you now that I am not an expert in electricity or electrical wiring. If you follow this video, you do so at your own risk. This is simply the items I found and the way I was able to get it done. When I was having the shop built, it was recommended that I build a sound deadened closet for an air compressor. It's 3 feet by 4 feet, plenty big for a 60 gallon. It has a plug that's 30 amp for the compressor already installed. It has a light fan combo at the top that moves 50 cubic feet per minute of air to keep the room cool when I'm running the compressor, and the fresh air will draw from under the door at the bottom. I went ahead and put some provisions in to hang things out of the way, and I also put a piece of 3/4 inch thick rubber mat on the floor to further isolate the compressor from vibration through the shop. The walls of the compressor closet are made with a special sheetrock called Quiet Rock. It's a layer of sheetrock and then a rubber sound deadening material and then another layer of sheetrock. And that's both outside as well as inside. And then this has 6-inch studs, 2x6s with insulation as well. So this should be extremely quiet. That will involve this diagram, some pipe, a regulator, a couple of pieces of poplar, and some pipe thread sealant. Definitely some power tools as well, something you don't want to miss. So that's it for part 1 of the Quincy air compressor install, getting it ready for the electrical connections. Be sure to stay tuned for part 2, which will be how I'm going to run the air line through the wall and into the shop, as well as conning some buddies of mine to come over and help me carry that 500-pound compressor into the closet. Visit my website, www.speedysgarage.net, for future shop updates.